It being the top of the hour, 11 a.m. at least here in Chicago, Central Time, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Jeff Wiseman. I'm a professor here in the Grace School at DePaul University. And it's my real pleasure to moderate our next panel following David's opener. And the name of our panel is Recovering Soft Power in Hard Power Times. And of course, the panel is something of a tribute to the passing this year of the creator of the soft power concept, Joseph Nye. And the panel title advances the claim, intuitively, I guess, that soft power in both practice and theory has experienced some sort of retreat in recent years. Now, that's a provocation, arguably, or an assumption. And our three panelists have critically engaged with the soft power concept for many years. And I'm very pleased to introduce them in the order that they will, in fact, give their presentations. Stephanie Winkler is a postdoc at Stockholm University. Stephanie wrote her dissertation on soft power and has followed this up amongst her many publications with a brilliantly provocative article this year, which I absolutely enjoyed and recommend. And it is, in fact, linked in the conference bio, by the way, for Stephanie on conceptual entrapment. After Stephanie, we will hear from my former close colleague at USC, Nick Cull. Nick is a leading scholar in public diplomacy, and he joins us from Los Angeles. And details of Nick's new book on reputational security are also linked in his bio for the conference. And our third panelist today is Jessica Ludwig. Jessica is a co-creator with Christopher Walker of the sharp power concept that has attracted a great deal of attention in recent years, including, in fact, from Joe Nye himself. Now, after the presenters have made their initial remarks, they will be around about 12-15 minutes for each of them. We will, as we did in the first panel this morning, have a question and answer segment. And what I invite you to do, for those people who do have a question, is to submit a written question via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A portal, not the chat feature. And I will direct your questions as best as I can to the individual speakers or to all of the panelists to speak or respond in turn. So we have an hour and 10 minutes total for our session. And so, Stephanie, the virtual floor is all yours. You're most welcome.
Right, fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the rather provocative title of today's talk. Let me just quickly share my slides. Perfect. If I got this right, you should be seeing only the slides and not my speaker notes, right?
Looks good.
Okay, fantastic. Good. Yeah, so today's talk I've called After Soft Power with a bit of a provocative question mark. And I hope you see soon where I'm going with this. Just to give you a little bit of context, the article itself is based on, the talk I mean, is based on themes I develop more fully in my ongoing book project on the soft power paradox. Now, I hope to submit the full manuscript later this year. It is a fully reworked version of my dissertation that I defended a few years ago. Other parts of today's talk are based on an article I published earlier in the European Journal of International Relations on conceptual entrapment. With that being said, let's just jump right in. So for anyone with an interest in international relations in the last 2 years, you have probably heard the sad news of the passing of Joseph Nye earlier in May this year. In the weeks following his death, there was a range of different obituaries that commented on Joseph Nye's role as the inventor of the soft power concept, that commented on his role as a scholar, as a public intellectual, and as a mentor and friend to many people who have been working in diplomacy in the last 4 decades or more. One theme that I thought was particularly interesting in that kind of obituary setting was how many used the moment of his passing to not just mourn the loss of a person, but also to mourn the loss of a world. And so there were articles that came out to say Joseph Nye's death marks the end of an era of US foreign policy, and how his persona was a champion of a world that no longer exists. Now, today's panel is, of course, called Recovering Soft Power in Hard Power Times. And as I know Jeff, he very much chose it somewhat provocatively also to give me a great starting point. But there's something going on here that I do want to unpack a little bit. For one thing, it assumes that soft power has faded, that it needs to be recovered, and that it is worthy of recovery. This is a bit of a sentiment that I'm calling soft power nostalgia. It is a yearning for a world where cooperation, morality, and attraction still mattered. And this is being juxtaposed to the world we're in right now, a world after soft power, where distrust, walls, authoritarian great powers, and of course a United States that is far less willing, able to sustain global leadership or even basic democratic principles seem to make the news on a daily basis. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that soft power nostalgia as such is very understandable. The thing though, and this is my point of departure here today, is that before we can even talk about recovering soft power as if it ever disappeared, before we can revive soft power tools, as if soft power diplomacy was inherently benign, and before we can advocate for more soft power funding, as if that label hadn't clouded our judgment before, what we need is a much overdue reckoning with the concept's complex history. This is precisely what my book project, The Soft Power Paradox, is trying to achieve by unpacking soft power's complex legacy. Among many other things, it demonstrates that the concept of soft power never disappeared. It remains wildly in circulation. We hear about it every single day. I come across it in parenting books. And so it's around, perhaps in a different form, but it is around nonetheless. Secondly, soft power was never particularly benign. In fact, my book demonstrates how the myth of its benignity legitimized contentious security agendas around the world, including the securitization of public diplomacy or controversial security reforms in Japan. Finally, soft power has also clouded analysis of global politics. And here I'm talking about how the normalization of soft power, the fact that everyone talks about it, researches it, speaks about it, has led to something that you could call a soft power mindset, where we start seeing everything from the perspective of soft power, even if that doesn't fully match empirical reality. And we've seen that quite a bit in the context of states such as Russia or China who are pursuing soft power, who are saying that they're pursuing soft power. And we may be critical towards their efforts. We may be talking about such efforts as clumsy, as authoritarian, as limited. And yet we always do this from a standpoint of soft power. And so kind of putting a lot of that behavior into the realm of legitimate and benign foreign policy activity, even though there's quite some problems with such a view. And of course, my colleague Jessica has been doing some very important work in that realm. Now, the book shows how soft power's story, in essence, is one of intense promotion, contestation, and appropriation, of many intended but even more unintended consequences, and those have shaped a range of phenomena, including how the world has understood and responded to China's rise. Ultimately, this book argues that soft power's trajectory has actually played a key role in shaping today's hard power era. And so simply returning to a somewhat golden age of soft power risks perpetuating rather than addressing our present challenges. And this is a little bit where I'm leaving you with, because I do hope that you're curious to read the book when it's finally there, because I do want to turn to something that is more tangible for the moment right now. And this is a call for self-reflexivity, and in particular, the notion of conceptual entrapment and what that actually does in the context of thinking about soft power. The thing is, namely, that reckoning with soft power's complex legacy is not just something out there, it is something that needs to begin with us. And yet, we rarely practice self-reflexivity when it comes to our own conceptual work, let alone include it into our analysis. You may have a coffee with a colleague about it, where you're being honest and frank, but it never really enters our analysis. And this is somewhat at the risk of stating the obvious, but our conceptual work is of course often shaped by factors that are beyond academic curiosity, that are beyond scholarly autonomy. We all require funding, we require exposure, we require citations. We require policy relevance. If we're not scholars or if we are policymakers, there is a range of different demands placed on us that are driving parts of our conceptual work. In addition to this, there's something special about concepts, and that is that they perform simultaneously in multiple worlds. And these are concepts like soft power, they are concepts like democracy, peace, resilience, public diplomacy. And when I say they perform simultaneously in multiple worlds, by this I mean that there's scholars who theorize them, operationalize them, measure them. But there's also political advocates who are trying to persuade governments or other groups of the rightfulness of their interpretation of, for instance, sovereignty as being contingent on the state's ability to protect its citizens. There's governments who are trying to implement these concepts or who are trying to dress up existing policies by using these concepts, some sort of window dressing. And there's an entire group of actors we don't even talk enough about, and those are the consultants that are trying to advise governments and others on best practices, but that have a clear commercial interest in the work they're doing. As you can see from this, there's different demands and different agendas involved in conceptual work. And yet, conceptual work still unfolds in the same terms of discourse as those we are studying. That is, we and those that we are studying use the same words. It is impossible to talk about soft power without using the word of soft power, right? And so we kind of get in this situation where there's endless contestation about the right meaning of it, the applicability of it, and so on and so forth. And so what I argue in the article is that this engages us in conceptual work quite per definition by staking a claim on the concept and does entangle us directly in the politics of the concept. Over time, and this comes together with other factors that are developed more deeply in the article, can lead to a sense of conceptual entrapment. Now, I define this as the rather complex relationship between scholars and their concepts. And by this, I mean the concepts that they coin, they use, critique, or promote in their work. Conceptual entrapment is fundamentally marked by a sense of ambivalence towards one's own concept and the consequences of one's conceptual work. And yet, because of penalties to one's identity, to one's prior work, or even to one's career, it is very hard to just walk away from it. Nor is it possible to fundamentally regain control over the concept. And that's precisely because we're all sharing the same language here. Effectively, what it does in terms of the soft power mindset is to make it really difficult to step out of it. Conceptual entrapment has a lot of different consequences. Among others, it kind of creates a body of literature that is driven by a factor, a body of knowledge that is driven by a factor we have as such not yet recognized, right? The way in which scholars relate to their concepts is actually one thing that shapes what we know about the world, what we, for instance, know about soft power. On a more personal level, it also comes with a loss of critical distance. And that happens especially as we start to begin assuming different roles, being cast in different roles that are oftentimes rather contradictory. And so myself, for instance, I thought of myself as a soft power critic, wanting to have a lot of distance between me and the soft power concept, wanting to call truth to power, right? But as I moved on, I got more and more into the role of an authority on soft power. I was literally being asked, me, a white person from a privileged university in the global north, to comment on, let's say, Japan's soft power efforts. And at the same time, as I was in such an awkward situation of knowledge advice, etc., I also know that they directly used the fact that I inquired about soft power in order to argue internally for more funds being diverted to soft power, because surely scholar Stephanie Winkler's interests demonstrate this is important. And so what I mean by this is also that there is, of course, a gradual loss of autonomy over concepts and our conceptual work as others start to pick it up. Now, in one of his later articles, when Joseph Nye has gotten very reflective of his work, he has this interesting metaphor where he likens soft power to a child that when it's young and helpless nearly, you can give it the best chance, right? You can raise it well and proper, but as it grows up, it goes and makes friends, good and bad. Now, I do find that a very intriguing characterization of his role and responsibility vis-à-vis soft power, but I do think it speaks a little bit to the issue of conceptual entrapment. The thing is, namely, in the end of the day, as critical and as nuanced as our work might actually be, by taking part in conceptual politics and just by using a concept, especially unreflectively, we are actually turning into concept entrepreneurs and more or less inadvertently perpetuate the very phenomenon we set out to dissect. And to just kind of drive that point home, I want to share here a personal anecdote that is precisely how I started with this article. So as I was finalizing my dissertation back in 2020 and prepared on the evening of my defense, practically what I was going to say during my defense, I had written a 350-page critical takedown on soft power. I got an email, and it was actually from Joseph Nye, congratulating me on a job well done, and telling me very happily that he was going to cite my dissertation in the next publication he has. And indeed, a week after my defense, my dissertation was already cited. And I can't help but feeling a sense of validation, but also a sense of entrapment, because my work, as critical as I tried to have it, was kind of sucked into the soft power orbit the moment it was in the public. You may think this is perhaps something of an individual experience, right? Something that only applies perhaps to early career scholars. The thing, though, is I would argue that it is a shared experience. I have talked to people who work on a range of different concepts, some of them trying to really take a critical perspective of them, in other cases just kind of running with the concepts because it is making their careers. But the thing is, when it comes to concepts, there is nearly no such thing as bad press. Sometimes the worse the concept, the more it's actually getting spread, as people are trying to give their 2 cents on why the concept has to be revised or returned. We rarely ever say we just should do away with that. Now, just to bring it back a little bit to where we started off, right? So I have a conclusion of this. I do agree with the premise that we are living during a time of great upheaval and that we are living in a hard power world. And the thing is here, of course, that such a time does increase the human reflex to rely on what is familiar, what is safe, what feels better, notwithstanding the possible pitfalls and unintended consequences of doing so. Hard power times, as such, makes us particularly susceptible to conceptual entrapment, I would argue, whether or not with a soft power concept or any other concept you might be trying to pursue right now in order to truly shape scholarship and maybe do something about those times of great upheaval. And in that context, from my perspective, the soft power nostalgia is something that may distract us a little from the concept's problematic legacy and its role in shaping today's hard power era. And so, in the end of the day, before we want to recover anything, there is, in my point, a great need for reflexivity of our discipline, of ourselves, as we're trying to think through how our scholarship and how our practices can be most fruitful and ethical in terms of addressing these turbulent times. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, that you really have brought to life the brilliant article that you published earlier this year on conceptual entrapment. And again, I would encourage everyone to have a look at that article as soon as they can. It is linked in your bio, Stephanie, so folks, please do have a look at it. And I think the way you've described Nye's own entrapment is really quite extraordinary, given the fact that he engaged in this conceptual debate and I suppose reflection to some extent, to put a sort of a neutral gloss on it, over 30 years, 35 years. It really is quite an extraordinary contribution that Nye has made to how we think about power, but what you're telling us now, how we think about concepts, and that really is very, very important. So thank you for that. Now, Nick Cull is our next speaker, and Nick has in fact been very much engaged in some important concepts such as public diplomacy and more recently on reputational security. And so, Nick, may I turn the floor over to you?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jeff. And it's a pleasure to be on with Stephanie and Jessica, both of whose work has, I think, pushed me in the direction that I'm headed right now. I certainly recognize Stephanie's talking about of conceptual entrapment, and not only is Nye an example of that, but I think also in the public diplomacy field, Simon Anholt and his experience with the nation brand concept is another example. Whereas Nye talked about being the parent of a child that went its own way, Simon talks about being, like Dr. Frankenstein, having created a creature that then goes on the rampage and creates havoc. I mean, for me, I come into this as someone who was trying to research the application of soft power in the field and ran into an explicit pushback from practitioners that for them soft power didn't make sense. And this occurred in a particular time, 2017, and in particular places where the reputation of the country was vulnerable. And for me, my waking up to being in a post soft power era, or at least a time when soft power didn't make sense in some places in the world. That happened in Kazakhstan, where a senior Kazakh diplomat said, look, the idea of soft power doesn't make sense in Kazakhstan. We are worried not about getting a little more the way that the soft power minded places like Germany, Japan, the United States are thinking about, or maybe if we were a little better known, we get something nicer for the country. For us, we just don't want to be Ukraine. We don't want something really horrible to happen to us the way that awful things happened to Ukraine in 2014. And so we want people to know us. And sitting right there in the Starbucks in Astana, I was trying to find a concept that this diplomat would agree with. And I said, well, are you talking about security coming from reputation? And he said, yes. And I said, so maybe we should be thinking about a concept of reputational security as an alternative to soft power. And he said, absolutely. And then the more countries I went to in this vulnerable state, the more in this vulnerable situation, they affirmed that for them, reputation was about security. And working backwards from that, I could then see how there were fundamental problems within soft power that meant that it might have been a great fit for 1990 to 2015, but it was running into difficulty. And Jessica's work is one of the things that started affirming this in a theoretical sense. That if we're looking at a world where soft power, as practiced and discussed and applied in public diplomacy policies, was always about adding something, enhancing something. But when Jessica started working on or speaking about sharp power and the idea that there was a whole negative dimension in international information, this opened up the whole if you like, the whole negative experience in image politics, that things were being taken away from countries, that their images were being disputed, and reputations were being diminished, or there was an attempt to diminish a reputation, and that has to be included. I think that a major problem with soft power is that because of the emphasis on being a form of power, it tended to be unilateral. And it was always spoken about as something that enhanced one country alone, or one country at a time, as if the international image dimension was a beauty contest of all against all, or a kind of battle royale. And the logic of soft power would be that if, for example, someone in Turkey decided that they were going to learn Italian, this would somehow be a defeat for the French. And it seemed to me that, in fact, that doesn't make any sense at all, that that would be a success for an idea of European culture, that somebody was choosing to immerse themselves in exposure to one particular state and society. I felt that soft power was becoming too general a concept and inherently contradictory. Did it really? And I think Nye admitted this, that the term became way too diluted. How could we have a concept that was used in such a way that the United States would speak about LGBT issues as a way of enhancing their soft power, and Russia would talk about opposing LGBT issues as a way of enhancing their soft power? So the same issue is being used for the same purpose, but from two completely different angles. You also had a very transactional approach to soft power coming out of China, and emphasis that was entirely different coming out of India and other players too. The fact that soft power was so hard to measure that measurements beyond the top 50 countries don't really make sense. And we even had measurements like the Portland Consultancy Soft Power 30, which implied that if there's a soft power 30 of 30 countries that have soft power, there must be a 170 no power or no soft power list out there as well, or countries that don't register, don't have a meaning for international audiences. And maybe that's true, but how much emphasis can we then put on an international relations concept that's irrelevant to most countries in the United Nations? And I think that if we're looking at how to build soft power, we'd come as certainly practice always emphasized better communication. Tell people more about how wonderful we are, not policy, and learn from international audiences what things no longer resonate or don't meet international standards, and remove those things. And as a historian, I had always run into moments in counter propaganda or moments in image development in international relations where a policy issue required a reputational challenge required a genuine policy change. And the strongest example of this is the way in which Eisenhower and Kennedy both realized that if they were going to rebut communist propaganda about the United States being a racist country, the best way to do this was to actually be less racist, not simply to say, well, jazz music sounds fantastic, or isn't Mal Whitfield a fantastic runner? They had to actually change reality. So this is what moved me into thinking about a broader concept of reputational security. I think that thinking about one another's reputations as partners in the reputation of a region or of a particular political philosophy makes more sense. Also leads to partnerships and makes it possible to think about something collective reputational security, if you like. And part of that has to be also pointing out to our fellow, the countries with whom we are reputationally linked, that certain behaviors are counterproductive and are dangerous to the collective well-being of our way of life. And right now, I think that certain things the United States is doing are dangerous to, or the state of the United States is dangerous to the reputation of democracy and is leading to security consequences. So maybe Jeff, just to round off, should I explain my definition of reputational security? I don't think I.
Yes, no, please do, Nick.
I see reputational security quite simply as being that element of security that comes from having a good reputation in the world. And that might sound like a very simplistic definition, but once you start thinking about the power of reputation, it links into much older concepts and foundational writing. I would say that the best example of what I'm talking about is Ukraine, and that in 2014, when the story of Ukraine was not known, really bad things happened to the country, that it lost provinces to Russian aggression. In 2022, after Ukraine having made great efforts to explain its story to the world, to engage through cultural diplomacy, to talk about its national narrative, to explain to Western media how its place name should be spelt, and delineate the distinctions, the cultural distinctions between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine was conceptually different, and it had a different reputation. And this led to different levels of behavior in 2022 when the full-scale invasion began. The governments were the same, but the population was different. And you saw 1,000 companies having to withdraw from Russia because the publics wouldn't tolerate them doing business with Russia. And that's about a reputational change and an immediate security that came from, or an enhanced security that came from that reputation. It meant that weapons were available. It meant that support was forthcoming. And we don't know whether that will lead to victory, because this is an enhanced security. It isn't a guaranteed security. But certainly Ukraine's position is better in reputational terms than it was. But I'll leave it there, and maybe we can come back to this in the discussion.
Thanks so much, Nick. That really was excellent. And I can say from a personal point of view that the several the several publications that you issued on this idea of reputational security really did inform my views about how successful Ukraine had been, given the enormous or the wave of pessimism immediately after the Russian invasion, which said that basically Ukraine will be gone in 2 weeks. And so I think thinking at it, the Ukraine problem, the Ukraine war, from reputational security perspectives or through their lenses is really very, very helpful. So that really is a contribution. And I encourage people to look at Nick's work on that, which again is linked in his bio for the conference. Nick, now I will move on to introduce or ask Jessica Ludwig to pick up the baton and even to basically, if she feels inclined after her prepared remarks, to say how she feels about whether she has been entrapped by her very famous concept of sharp power that she co-created with Christopher Walker. So Jessica, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the conference and to join DePaul for the first time. And so the floor is yours. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, David, and to other staff at the Grace School who've invited us and put this very interesting panel together today. And I really appreciate both Stephanie and Nicholas's remarks. To Stephanie's point as well about all of us coming from our own position and looking at soft power through the lens of our own career, our own past record of work. I would perhaps start out by noting I tend to look at soft power in the lens of something that's long been of interest to me, which is contestation of values between democracies and autocracies. And I've sat in some very unique institutions where I've been able to interact with practitioners of democracy, with academics, with policymakers, and at the intersection of this space. So I hope what I can add today, at least, given my own background and recognizing that I do come in with my own biases as well to this conversation, is be something of a qualified optimist on the future of soft power, because I think it's a concept that is actually worth unpacking much more than perhaps we've done in recent years. So we've all talked about Joseph Nye and the legacy that that he has given us a basis for conversation. He tended to identify three different forms of power projection that states could use. The first being hard power, the use of typically military means or other means of compelling behavior. So by he also thought about power as the ability to influence others to achieve an objective that's your goal. You could do that through compulsion, through hard power. You could do it through economic power or payments, as he liked to describe them, where both sides are benefiting in a transactional relationship. Or it could be accomplished through soft power. Soft power being the ability to win hearts and minds through, I think most fundamentally, and what I will keep coming back to today, is this idea of attraction. What is attractive? And so the reason, well, really, when Joseph Nye was coining this concept of soft power and distinguishing it from hard power and economic power, was in the early era of the early post-Cold War era. And really over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen globalization pose new challenges for governments around the world. It's also created new opportunities. And in terms of thinking about how autocratic regimes in particular are interacting with the new world, there was, in the post-Cold War era, there was this assumption that by the West and by the world's established democracies opening themselves up, that our values would be inherently attractive and they would reach the foreign publics of some of these closed societies. And that would induce change and democratic opening in those countries around the world. And in fact, what we saw, and I think what Freedom House's annual rating of freedom around the world have demonstrated, is that over the last 19 years, we've seen freedom decline around the world. So quite the opposite effect. So that begs some questions. Why are we seeing that? And it's because we didn't anticipate how autocratic regimes would try to take advantage of some of these new cross-cutting domains that globalization opened up, and that they would experiment and evolve with some of the tools that they saw democracies and open societies using, chiefly some of the things that we've thought about through concepts we already have at our disposal through the soft power lens. So we saw countries like China and Russia, who've always been at the forefront. There have been other actors that have come and gone as well over the past decade or two, who've had different abilities, different resources at their disposal to begin to play in this space. They've started making investments in things like broadcasting state-supported international media, like China Global Television Network, or their Xinhua Wire service, in Russia's case, Russia Today and Sputnik. These are platforms that now have global reach. We saw the proliferation of state-linked research institutions and even international policy forums, things that were copycatting other international convenings, exchange programs, scholarship opportunities, the establishment of cultural institutions in other countries around the world. Grand concepts, even like in China's case, the Belt and Road Initiative, something we're all still talking about very much, and even moving to establish their own digital and technological platforms and start to compete in this race to set standards on how those would evolve. But it seemed that many observers, to Stephanie's point, they were tending to view these activities through the lens of soft power. And that led to reaching for public opinion polls as a metric for trying to gauge whether or not autocratic countries like China and Russia were succeeding in the soft power space. Were they winning hearts and minds? Were they gaining a more favorable opinion from foreign publics around the world? And generally in the early to mid 2000s and the 2010s, the data generally demonstrated that these seemingly soft power investments were moving the needle, and that led a lot of policymakers, analysts, and other observers to overlook and ultimately underestimate the effects. So my colleague and I at the National Endowment for Democracy, Christopher Walker, thought that there needed to be a more critical exploration of these initiatives in domains that we traditionally understood as soft power influence. So in media and tech and information, knowledge generation, culture and entertainment, commerce, and technology, and look at how these were having an impact in targeted countries. So through a series of iterative research initiatives that looked both at how China and Russia were from the top down trying to exploit some of these soft power tools and also compare them with a bottom up perspective, we saw that something was happening when at that interaction point that was different. And there was an intended goal there that was different, that revealed that we needed a new concept. And that's how we came to the term sharp power, which is a way to distinguish those activities, those initiatives that play in the public domains of open societies that aren't about winning hearts and minds, but that are about exerting control, that affect censorship, neutralize criticism, and are intentionally trying to muddy the waters of debate in the free marketplace of ideas, so that it becomes difficult to distinguish what's authentic, genuine, and true from that which is propaganda and false information. And so some of those soft power tools in which authoritarian regimes were investing, some of them were indeed conducted in a typical fashion, but others were designed in a way that had built-in features to facilitate the top-down control. And that, in effect, that's what distinguishes sharp power from soft power, as you see these colored programmatic outputs that exploit the openness of democratic systems, while at the same time raise barriers to their own societies. For example, in the previous panel, one of the panelists mentioned how X is a platform that Beijing and Chinese Communist Party authorities use regularly to communicate with the rest of the world, but it's a platform that's banned inside of China. Sharp power methods of engagement tend to privilege the projection of state power more than they reflect the characteristics of a society's institutions, values, people, and culture. Those are some of the things that, according to Nye, typically are the source, the original fountain of soft power. That's where those attractive qualities should be coming from. And when they're repressed, what you're seeing is actually more of a distortion. Again, sharp power tends to stimulate censorship. It can act as a spoiler by stoking societal divisions, take advantage of knowledge gaps, and manipulate and undermine the integrity of independent institutions and foreign societies. So that's what I wanted to cover about, at least to introduce the concept of sharp power. But I think what's relevant for us today is what this reveals about soft power. And I think this is where sort of to update my own thinking. I've been thinking a lot about this recently, as we do seem to see around the world, even democracies, just given the nature of challenges, shifting towards considering that they might need to use more hard power or transactional forms of power to achieve what they want. But I think fundamentally what sharp power shows us is that the ideas and values are still incredibly powerful, and they're worthwhile. And that's why autocrats have tried their best to act and leverage the soft power tools in this space. But I think we often, in democracies, we tend to take for granted sometimes the benefits that we've accrued through some of the soft power gains democracies have around the world. Like, why do dictatorships still go through the motions of carrying out elections, even though they might have to go to great lengths to fix them? They're still doing this, and we shouldn't overlook that. open societies need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that sharp power and authoritarian influence projection pose, especially to the integrity of quality of debate in our own societies. But I fear that there has been a lesson that many open societies have taken because they've become so fearful. That vulnerability is no longer, it's been seen as a weakness. And even though I think democracies in the United States we've made some strides in recognizing that autocrats are trying to compete with us beyond hard power, but in this gray zone space, somewhere between soft power and hard power, and through coercive means. It's really up to us in democracies and open societies, to reflect more on how soft power has actually been a strategic competitive advantage that we see autocratic regimes around the world really struggling to fully leverage. If we go back to this attractive nature of soft power, and think about it in its purest sense, right? Soft power can do things that hard power can't. It builds trust, it demonstrates credibility, and that can help sustain alliances. Innovation is, again, usually inherently attractive. That generates trade and economic growth and helps expand industries. Soft power enables societies to attract the world's best and brightest, and that, again, helps fuel and sustain that innovation that economic growth depends on. People-to-people ties foster knowledge exchange, understanding, and that helps advance peace and diplomacy. Soft-powered tools like well-designed foreign assistance and humanitarian programs or support for democratic actors and governance institutions help stabilize, strengthen, and enhance the security of societies around the world that are struggling, which minimizes the need for exerting hard power, which is actually much costlier to leverage. So just as a final point of reflection that I want to end on is actually a question that I think sharp power helps raise about soft power. And that is really, to what extent soft power can be wielded by states. Soft power can be exerted in two ways, and the way that Joseph and I tended to talk about it was through the deliberate use of tools that are designed to leverage it, such as some of the things we've talked about, people-to-people exchange programs, these humanitarian foreign assistance programs. But there's also, and I think this is what Nicholas's work helps to elevate, there's a reputational element as well. And that stems from how foreign leaders, publics, and other citizens of other countries formulate their own opinion about another society. But the attractive qualities of soft power are generally derived from products and outputs that reflect a society's values, culture, and innovation. And this bottom-up dynamic makes soft power somewhat unruly and difficult for states to directly employ, because governments can leverage it through tools, but they can't manufacture it. And so when a government tries to, from the top down, control soft power tools, or again, the sources of soft power that societies that flow, where soft power flows from in a society, they can damage them and undermine the uniqueness and the credibility that those independent institutions in a society have. And ultimately, there's a risk of rendering that authenticity ineffective. And so we need to think more about these reputational aspects of soft power. The fact that they come from what I believe are ultimately universally attractive values and ideas, things like freedom, a sense of security, integrity and reliability, creativity and innovation, and cultural expression. And so where we see regimes and political leaders that are uncomfortable with this, there's a risk of, again, losing that inherent attractiveness that open societies have benefited from when we're thinking about soft power. And particularly in the United States, I think we really need to give more thought to how we've benefited, and whether or not this is something as a society that we still value. Are we committed to preserving the attractiveness of some of these values that we have long represented?
But could I jump immediately back in on that, Jeff? Because I think that what Jessica's making a really important point, that it's the values that are attractive, not the geography. And people might have a habit of associating the geography of the United States with freedom. But if the United States does not embody freedom in its policies, then the soft power will go to the places that do, and is already going to. For the first time this week, the US dropped out of the top 14 in the Anhalt Nation Brands Index. It's the first time any country has dropped out of the top 10. It's now number 14. So the world is noticing the changes here. And I'm very worried that the United States is so used to being number one that it doesn't really understand the way in which their contract with these concepts has been violated. And the other thing I'd say is that the idea of wielding, when we talk about wielding soft power, that's inherently repulsive, as when an individual makes too much about their own attractiveness. You know, I think that she's not usually mentioned in international relations, but Carly Simon's song, "You're So Vain, You Probably Think This Song Is About You," makes the point that when somebody pays too much attention to their appearance and how attractive they are, it pushes people away. And I think that scales for nation states.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks to our panelists again. Again, you've reminded us all of the importance of updating our own thinking on our concepts in general. So thanks very much for doing that. We do have nearly 15 minutes break through to our keynote speaker today, who is Virginia Gamba, who was the UN Secretary General's representative for children in armed conflict for 8 years. So I do hope that as many of you as possible can join us for that keynote at the bottom of the hour. Thanks so much, panelists, and thanks to the audience.